They said humans were weak. They said we were fragile, emotional creatures who would crumble under the weight of galactic society. They were wrong about so many things, but what they didn't expect was this. When you silence a human, when you strip away their voice and forbid them from speaking, they don't disappear. They don't fade into nothing. They find another way. And sometimes, that way changes everything. This is the story of how one woman, forbidden to speak a single word, managed to turn an entire alien empire upside down with nothing but determination, creativity, and 3 words from the most unexpected source imaginable. The transport ship hummed with a frequency that made Sarah Chen's teeth ache. She sat on the cold metal bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, surrounded by 24 other humans who wore the same expression she did, fear mixed with stubborn determination. None of them spoke. None of them dared to, not after what had happened to Marcus. Sarah touched her throat instinctively, feeling the smooth metal of the translator collar that every human was required to wear in Caliph space. The collar itself wasn't uncomfortable, but what it represented made her stomach turn. 3 days ago, Marcus Reynolds had argued with a Caliph guard about rations. He'd raised his voice, used what the Caliph considered aggressive verbal patterns. The punishment had been swift and brutal. His translator was modified to deliver an electric shock every time he attempted to speak above a whisper. After 6 hours of intermittent shocks, Marcus had fallen silent entirely. Now he sat in the corner of the transport, his eyes hollow, his lips pressed into a thin line. The Caliph Empire had rules. So many rules. And humans, in their estimation, broke too many of them simply by being themselves. Attention human cargo. The voice crackled through the transport speaker system. The universal translator rendered the Caliph words into flat, emotionless English. We will arrive at processing station Theta 7 in 20 minutes. You will disembark in an orderly fashion. You will not speak unless directly addressed by a Caliph official. You will not make eye contact with Caliph citizens. You will not touch any Caliph property without explicit permission. Violation of these rules will result in immediate disciplinary action. The Caliph Empire welcomes you to your new assignment. Sarah exchanged glances with her friend, Dr. Lisa Park, who sat beside her. Lisa's jaw was clenched so tight that Sarah could see the muscle twitching. They'd been through orientation together, endured the same degrading lectures about human inferiority, learned the same impossible list of rules that governed every aspect of their existence in Caliph space. The Caliph were apex predators from a high-gravity world, standing nearly 8 feet tall with 4 arms and skin that looked like polished obsidian. They'd achieved faster-than-light travel 3,000 years before humans had even invented the wheel. When Earth had finally stumbled onto the galactic stage 50 years ago, humanity had been met with a mixture of curiosity, condescension, and outright contempt from various alien species. But none had been quite as dismissive as the Caliph. To them, humans were laborers at best, useful for their small size and dexterity, employed in maintenance work, data processing, and other tasks that the Caliph considered beneath their dignity. But human nature, with its tendency toward emotional expression, questioning authority, and forming tight social bonds, constantly put them at odds with Caliph regulations. The transport shuddered as it began its docking sequence. Sarah gripped the edge of the bench, her knuckles white. This was it. The beginning of her 5-year contract working in the archives of the Caliph Military Command. 5 years of silence, of keeping her head down, of pretending to be the obedient little worker drone they expected. The hatch opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and the humans filed out into the processing station. The facility was massive, all chrome surfaces, and harsh white lighting that made Sarah's eyes water. Caliph guards stood at regular intervals, their 4 arms crossed over their broad chests, their dark eyes tracking every movement the humans made. A Caliph official approached, this one wearing the crimson sash that indicated administrative authority. Human workers for the military archives, it said, consulting a data pad held in one of its lower hands. You will proceed to decontamination, then to your assigned quarters. Your work shifts begin tomorrow at the start of the 6th cycle. Do not be late. The humans moved as a group toward the decontamination chambers, still not speaking, still not daring to draw attention to themselves. Sarah felt the weight of a dozen alien eyes on her back as they walked. The Caliph watched them the way someone might watch insects, with a mixture of distaste and clinical interest. The decontamination process was humiliating. Standing in a small chamber, while jets of chemical spray hit her from all angles, while scanners examined every inch of her body for contraband or biological threats. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to think of home, of the small apartment in Seattle she'd left behind, of her mother's face when they'd said goodbye at the spaceport. "Why are you doing this?" her mother had asked, tears streaming down her weathered face. 5 years, Sarah. 5 years so far from home, working for aliens who treat us like slaves. "Because someone has to," Sarah had replied, hugging her mother tight. "Because if we don't take these jobs, if we don't prove that humans can work alongside the rest of the galaxy, we'll never be more than a backwater species everyone ignores. I can handle 5 years, Mom. I'm stronger than you think." Now, standing in the decontamination chamber with chemicals burning her eyes, Sarah wondered if she'd overestimated her own strength. The quarters were small but functional. Sarah shared a room with Lisa and 2 other women, Yuki and Amara. For bunks, a small shared bathroom, and a footlocker each for personal belongings. That was it. No decorations, no personal touches, nothing that might indicate these rooms were occupied by living beings with personalities and preferences. "This is insane," Lisa whispered once the door had closed behind them, and they were alone. She kept her voice barely audible, paranoid that someone might be listening. "Did you see how they looked at us? Like we're not even people." "Keep your voice down," Yuki hissed, glancing at the door nervously. She was the youngest of their group, barely 21, fresh out of university with a degree in xenolinguistics. "If they hear you complaining, I know. Lisa cut her off, rubbing her face tiredly. More shocks, more punishments, more reminders that we're second-class citizens in our own galaxy. Amara, who'd been unpacking her meager belongings in silence, finally spoke. Her voice was measured and calm, the product of years working in customer service before taking this job. "We survive by being smart about this. We follow the rules, we do our jobs, we keep our heads down. 5 years will pass before we know it." Sarah sat on her assigned bunk, the thin mattress barely cushioning the metal frame beneath. 5 years. It had seemed manageable when she'd signed the contract back on Earth, seduced by the promise of adventure and the generous salary that would let her mother retire comfortably. Now, after less than a day in Caliph space, 5 years felt like an eternity. That night, Sarah lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the station. The hum of environmental systems, the distant clank of machinery, the occasional heavy footfall of a Caliph guard making rounds. She thought about Marcus, about the blank look in his eyes after they'd broken something fundamental in him. She thought about all the rules they'd been given, the endless list of prohibitions designed to keep humans small and quiet and manageable. And she thought about her grandfather, who'd fought in the resource wars, who'd survived 5 years in a prisoner of war camp, and come home with stories of resilience and creativity in the face of oppression. He'd told her once, when she was young and angry about some perceived injustice, "Sarah girl, sometimes the system is designed to break you. But humans are survivors. We find ways. We always find ways." The next morning began at what Sarah's body still insisted was 3 in the morning, though the station operated on a Caliph cycle that bore no relationship to Earth's 24-hour day. The humans gathered in the cafeteria for a brief meal of nutrition paste, bland and textureless, but apparently sufficient to keep them functional. Then, they were herded to the archives. The military archives were a vast underground complex, row upon row of data terminals and physical storage units containing millions of years of Caliph military history. Sarah's job, along with 50 other humans working this shift, was to scan and digitize physical documents that predated the Caliph digital era. It was tedious work, requiring attention to detail and steady hands, but not much else. Their supervisor was a Caliph named Vexthar, shorter than average for his species at only 7 feet tall, with a distinctive scar across his upper left arm. He regarded the human workers with barely concealed contempt as he outlined their assignments. "You will each process a minimum of 500 documents per shift," Vexthar said, his voice a low rumble that the translators rendered as clipped and harsh. Quality checks will be conducted randomly. Errors will result in penalties. You will work in silence. You will not leave your stations without permission. You will not touch any document marked with security classifications above level 3. Are these instructions clear? The humans nodded in unison, not daring to speak. I asked if these instructions are clear. Vexthar repeated, his dark eyes narrowing. You will respond verbally when a Caliph superior addresses you. Yes, sir, Sarah said along with the others, keeping her voice respectful and quiet. Better, Vexthar said with satisfaction. Remember your place here, humans. You are tools. Useful tools, but tools nonetheless. Perform your function adequately, and you will be tolerated. Now begin. Sarah moved to her assigned workstation, a small desk with a document scanner and a data terminal. The first document in her queue was an old battle report, the text written in ancient Caliph script on something that looked like treated animal hide. She carefully positioned it in the scanner, adjusted the settings to capture every detail, and began the slow process of conversion. Hours passed in monotonous routine. Scan, verify, upload, repeat. The documents told stories of Caliph military campaigns against now extinct species, of battles fought over resources and territory, of an empire built on the assumption of Caliph superiority over all other forms of life. Sarah found herself growing increasingly disturbed by what she was reading, by the casual cruelty and dismissive attitude toward non-Caliph life that permeated every document. Midway through her shift, Sarah's terminal chimed with a priority override. A new document had been flagged for immediate processing, marked as time-sensitive. She pulled up the assignment and felt her blood run cold. It was a document outlining new protocols for human workers in Caliph facilities. As she scanned through the text, her hands began to shake. The new protocols went far beyond the existing restrictions. They included mandatory psychological conditioning, designed to make humans more compliant and less likely to form social bonds with each other. They included provisions for extended contracts, essentially allowing the Caliph to keep human workers indefinitely if they were deemed particularly useful. And, most chilling of all, they included a provision that would prohibit humans from speaking any language other than Caliph Standard, enforced through modifications to the translator collars that would shock them for using their native tongues. This wasn't about maintaining order. This was about erasing human identity entirely, about turning them into perfect, obedient tools with no connection to their own culture or each other. Sarah sat frozen at her terminal, staring at the document on her screen. She needed to tell the others. She needed to warn them about what was coming. But how? Any overt communication would be noticed by the Caliph supervisors. Any attempt to organize resistance would result in immediate and severe punishment. She glanced around the archives, at the other humans bent over their workstations, at the Caliph guards stationed at regular intervals throughout the room, at the security cameras mounted in every corner. They were being watched constantly, their every move monitored and assessed. But Sarah Chun had not come to the Caliph Empire to be broken. She had not left Earth and her family behind to become a mindless drone. And she would not let these protocols go into effect without a fight, even if that fight had to be conducted in complete silence. The idea came to her slowly, piecing itself together from fragments of memory and observation. The Caliph assumed humans would use words to communicate, to organize, to resist. So they restricted speech, monitored conversations, punished vocal dissent. But humans had been finding ways to communicate without words for thousands of years. Sarah thought about her friend Kenji back on Earth, who was deaf and had taught her basic sign language one summer. She thought about the elaborate systems of codes and signals prisoners of war had developed throughout human history. She thought about the millions of ways humans had always found to pass messages, to maintain connections, to resist oppression even in the most restrictive circumstances. The Caliph had made a fundamental miscalculation. They thought that by controlling human speech, they could control human communication. But they had never bothered to truly study human history, had never appreciated the depths of human creativity and stubbornness when backed into a corner. Sarah began to plan. Sarah waited until the end of her shift, when the exhausted human workers trudged back to their quarters. In the cafeteria during the brief evening meal period, she sat with Lisa, Yuki, and Amara, pushing nutrition paste around her plate while her mind raced through possibilities. She needed to communicate what she discovered, but any direct conversation would be overheard by the Caliph guards who patrolled the dining area. Instead, Sarah began to eat her meal in an odd pattern. She took 3 bites, paused, took 2 more, paused again, then took 1 more bite. Lisa noticed first, her eyebrows furrowing in confusion. Sarah repeated the pattern, 3, 2, 1. Then, she tapped her water container 3 times with her spoon, then twice, then once. Lisa's eyes widened slightly. She was smart enough to recognize that Sarah was trying to communicate something, even if she didn't understand what yet. Sarah caught her eye and very deliberately glanced toward the Caliph guard station, then back at Lisa, then down at her plate. Then she repeated her pattern again, 3 bites, 2 bites, 1 bite. It was crude and limited, but it was a start. That night, back in their shared quarters, Sarah lay in her bunk and began to work out a more sophisticated system. She couldn't write it down because all their belongings were subject to random searches, but she committed it to memory. Simple gestures that could be disguised as natural movements. A hand brushing through hair meant, pay attention. Touching the left wrist meant danger. Touching the right wrist meant, safe to proceed. Different combinations of fingers held up while scratching an arm or adjusting clothing could represent numbers or simple concepts. Over the next week, Sarah slowly, carefully taught this system to Lisa, then to Yuki and Amara, then to a few other trusted humans in their work group. They practiced in moments when the Caliph weren't directly observing them. In the showers, during the brief periods between shifts, in the seconds when a guard's attention was elsewhere. Every gesture had to look completely natural, completely innocent if a Caliph happened to notice. The Caliph had no context for understanding human nonverbal communication beyond the most obvious facial expressions. They didn't know that a specific way of crossing arms could carry meaning, or that tapping patterns could spell out words, or that even the direction someone looked could convey information. Their own communication was almost entirely verbal, supplemented by pheromone signals that humans couldn't detect. The concept of a complex gestural language was outside their frame of reference. 2 weeks into her assignment, Sarah had established a basic communication network among 30 human workers in the archives. They passed information through gestures, warnings about which Caliph supervisors were particularly harsh, tips about which documents should be processed carefully, and, gradually, carefully, information about the new protocols Sarah had discovered. But gestures alone weren't enough. Sarah needed a way to preserve information, to build something permanent that could outlast individual memory. She began to experiment with her actual assigned work, looking for opportunities within the document scanning process itself. The ancient Caliph documents she processed were full of decorative elements, elaborate borders, and flourishes that were considered important parts of the historical record. Sarah realized that she could add her own flourishes to the digital scans, tiny modifications to the decorative elements that would never be noticed by a Caliph reviewer but could carry meaning to someone who knew what to look for. A small additional curve in a border design could represent a letter. A slight variation in the shading of a decorative element could indicate a number. Sarah began encoding messages directly into the work she was supposed to be doing, hiding information about the new protocols, about working conditions, about everything the humans needed to know to survive and resist in plain sight within the Caliph's own archives. It was risky. If anyone discovered what she was doing, the punishment would be severe. But Sarah remembered her grandfather's words, "Humans find ways." And she remembered something else he'd told her, something about the importance of documentation, of making sure that even if you were silenced, your message survived. The most powerful thing you can do in the face of oppression, he'd said, is to leave a record. To make sure that someone, someday, knows what happened and knows that people resisted. So Sarah created her record, one document at a time, one tiny encoded flourish at a time. And as she worked, she noticed something interesting. The Caliph military archives didn't just contain documents about battles and campaigns. They also contained correspondence, personal logs from high-ranking officers, strategic assessments that revealed far more about the inner workings of the Caliph Empire than anyone probably intended to share with human workers. Sarah began to pay more attention to these documents, to actually read them rather than just mechanically scanning and uploading them. She learned about faction disputes within the Caliph military command, about resources being diverted from frontier defenses to internal security, about growing unrest among the Caliph population itself over economic policies. The empire that presented such a unified, monolithic face to the rest of the galaxy was actually riddled with internal tensions and competing interests. This was valuable intelligence, the kind of information that could be useful if Earth ever needed to negotiate with the Caliph from a position of strength. But how could she get this information back home? Communication with Earth was strictly controlled. Human workers could send brief, monitored messages once per month, and any content that the Caliph deemed sensitive was simply deleted. Sarah puzzled over this problem for days. Then, she remembered something from her orientation briefing, a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time. Once per year, human workers were allowed to send a physical care package back to Earth, containing small personal items that had been thoroughly inspected and approved by Caliph security. The packages were examined for contraband or prohibited materials, but the Caliph were looking for weapons, drugs, or stolen Caliph property. They weren't looking for information encoded in innocent-seeming objects. It would take time to prepare such a package, and it would take incredible precision to encode complex information in a way that would survive the inspection, but could be decoded by someone on Earth who knew what to look for. But Sarah had time, and she had motivation. And she had one thing the Caliph had consistently underestimated: human ingenuity born of desperation. She began to collect small items that were technically allowed under Caliph regulations. A decorative scarf made from synthetic fibers that she purchased with her meager wages from the station commissary. A small sketchbook and basic art supplies, permitted because they were considered a harmless outlet for human creative impulses. A set of beads for making simple jewelry, a common enough hobby among human workers. In her free time, Sarah began to work on these items, adding patterns and designs that looked purely aesthetic but actually encoded detailed information about the Caliph archives, about the intelligence she'd gathered, about the new protocols that were being planned. The pattern in the scarf was a map of the archive layout and security systems. The sketches in her book contained embedded data into shading and line work. The arrangements of beads on the jewelry, she made spelled out messages in a code based on old Earth ciphers that she'd studied in university. Lisa watched her work one evening, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You're brilliant," she whispered, "and completely insane. If they catch you, then they catch me," Sarah said quietly, not looking up from the bracelet she was beating. "But maybe they won't. And maybe, just maybe, this information gets back to people who can do something with it." "You really think we can make a difference?" Yuki asked from her bunk. She'd been growing increasingly despondent, worn down by the daily grind of meaningless work and constant surveillance. "We're just a few dozen humans out of billions. What difference can we possibly make?" Sarah set down her beating and looked at each of her roommates in turn. Every resistance movement in human history started with just a few people who refused to accept that the system couldn't be changed. The Caliph think they have us figured out. They think that by controlling our voices, they control us. But they're wrong. We're still here. We're still human. And we're going to remind them that humanity doesn't break as easily as they think. The next day, Sarah discovered that the Caliph had made a mistake. In their arrogance, they had assigned a human worker to process documents that contained security protocols for their own facilities. The protocols weren't classified at the highest levels, probably because the Caliph assumed that no human could possibly understand or make use of such technical information. But Sarah understood perfectly well. She understood guard rotation schedules, security camera blind spots, the locations of communication hubs, and data storage facilities. She understood, and she encoded every bit of that information into her work, hiding it in plain sight while the Caliph's supervisors walked past her station without a second glance. 3 months into her assignment, Sarah's communication network had grown to include over 100 human workers across multiple departments. They developed an elaborate system of signals and codes, ways to share information, and coordinate actions without ever speaking a word that could be overheard or recorded. Small acts of resistance began to multiply. Work slowdowns disguised as technical difficulties, accidental damage to non-critical Caliph equipment, documents processed just slightly wrong in ways that would take the Caliph months to notice and fix. None of it was enough to seriously disrupt Caliph operations, but that wasn't the point. The point was to prove to themselves and to each other that they weren't helpless, that they could still act, still make choices, still assert their humanity in the face of a system designed to erase it. And then, everything changed because of a routine maintenance assignment, and a Caliph warrior named Calvor, who was nothing like what Sarah expected. The maintenance assignment came down through the usual channels. A data terminal in the deep archives had malfunctioned, and Sarah was sent to assist with repairs because of her small size and dexterity. The terminal was located in a restricted section that required special clearance, and she would be accompanied by a Caliph military officer to ensure she didn't access any sensitive information. Sarah arrived at the designated meeting point to find a Caliph warrior waiting for her. He was massive even by Caliph standards, easily 8.5 feet tall, with the scars and bearing of someone who'd seen extensive combat. The insignia on his uniform indicated he was a high-ranking officer, which made Sarah nervous. High-ranking Caliph tended to be even more dismissive of humans than the average citizen. "You are the human technician?" Calvor asked, his voice a deep rumble that the translator rendered more clearly than most Caliph speech. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, keeping her eyes down respectfully. "Follow," Calvor commanded, and began walking toward the restricted archives without waiting to see if she complied. Sarah hurried to keep up with his long strides, her toolkit clutched in her hands. The restricted archives were even more vast than the regular sections, and considerably older. The air had a stale quality to it, and the lighting was dimmer, as if this area wasn't regularly visited. The malfunctioning terminal was located in a chamber lined with ancient storage containers, the kind used before digital systems became standard. Calvor stood guard by the entrance while Sarah approached the terminal and began her diagnostic. The problem was simple enough, a failed power coupling that needed to be replaced. But, as Sarah worked, she couldn't help but notice the documents displayed on the terminal screen. They were personnel files, records of Caliph warriors who'd served in something called the Integration Wars. As she reached behind the terminal to access the power coupling, her hand accidentally brushed against the screen, causing it to scroll to a different record. What she saw made her freeze. It was a record of civilian casualties during the Integration Wars, a conflict that had apparently occurred 2,000 years ago when the Caliph had forcibly integrated several dozen species into their empire. The numbers were staggering. Billions of sentient beings killed, entire civilizations erased because they'd refused to submit to Caliph rule. "You are taking longer than expected." Calvor's voice came from behind her, making her jump. "Is there a problem?" Sarah's mind raced. She was looking at information that was clearly not meant for human eyes. Information that revealed the Caliph Empire's history of genocide on a scale that dwarfed anything in human history. If Calvor realized what she'd seen, she'd be lucky if they simply executed her. "The power coupling is fused," Sarah said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I need to cut it free before I can replace it. It will take a few more minutes." She heard Calvor move closer, his heavy footfalls making the floor vibrate. Sarah kept her eyes on her work, her hands trembling as she used her tools to carefully remove the damaged component. "You saw the files," Calvor said. It wasn't a question. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. She considered lying, but something in his tone made her hesitate. She glanced up at him, meeting his eyes for the first time. Caliph's eyes were solid black, unreadable to human perception. But his body language, the way his forearms hung at his sides rather than being crossed in the typical Caliph posture of authority, seemed somehow less hostile than she'd expected. "Yes, sir," she admitted quietly. "I'm sorry. It was an accident." Calvor was silent for a long moment. Then, he did something Sarah had never seen a Caliph do before. He reached out with one of his upper hands and deliberately turned off his translator collar. Sarah stared at him in confusion. Without the translator, they couldn't understand each other. The Caliph language was completely incomprehensible to human ears, just as human speech was meaningless noise to the Caliph. Why would he cut off their ability to communicate? Then, Calvor spoke, his voice still that same deep rumble, but now without the translator rendering it into English. Sarah heard only alien sounds, complex and rhythmic, but carrying no meaning to her. But Calvor's body language was unmistakable. He gestured at the screen, then at himself, then made a complex series of movements with his four hands that seemed deliberate and purposeful. He was trying to communicate something outside the translation system, something he didn't want recorded by the collars they were forced to wear. Sarah made a split-second decision that would change everything. She reached up and turned off her own translator collar. The hum that had been a constant presence in her ears since she'd arrived in Caliph space suddenly ceased. The silence felt enormous, disorienting. Calvor looked at her with what might have been surprise or approval. It was impossible to tell. Then he spoke again, his voice still incomprehensible, but this time he accompanied his words with gestures. He pointed at her, then at himself. He held up his hands in a way that suggested equivalence or equality. Then he did something that shocked Sarah to her core. He placed one of his massive hands over where a human heart would be in his chest, a gesture that looked remarkably similar to a human gesture of sincerity. Sarah understood. Somehow, impossibly, this Caliph warrior was trying to tell her that he didn't see her as inferior, that he saw them as equals despite everything the Caliph Empire stood for. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at Calvor, trying to process what was happening. She'd spent months viewing the Caliph as a monolithic oppressor, an entire species united in their contempt for humanity. The possibility that one of them might think differently had never occurred to her. Slowly, carefully, Sarah gestured back. She pointed at the screen with the casualty records, then made a questioning gesture with her hands, eyebrows raised. She needed to know if Calvor understood what those files represented, if he knew about the atrocities his empire had committed. Calvor's posture shifted, his four shoulders sagging in what looked remarkably like grief or shame. He reached past her to the terminal and began scrolling through the files, revealing page after page of documented genocide. Entire species reduced to footnotes in Caliph military records. Civilizations that had begged for mercy, offered peaceful integration, and been destroyed anyway because they'd hesitated too long in their submission. Then, Calvor did something that made Sarah's breath catch. He pointed at the records, then made a slashing gesture across his throat with one hand, a gesture that apparently had similar meaning in Caliph culture. Wrong, evil, unforgivable. He was telling her that he knew, that he understood the horror of what his empire had done, and that he condemned it. Sarah made a decision in that moment that was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper she'd been using to sketch ideas for her encoded jewelry. She grabbed the stylus from the terminal and began to draw. Not words, which might be difficult to interpret across species, but simple images. She drew a stick figure of a human, then a representation of a caliph with four arms. She drew them standing side by side, not in a hierarchy but as equals. Then she drew bars over them, representing their imprisonment or restriction. And finally, she drew those bars being broken. She showed the drawing to Calvor, her heart pounding. She was revealing herself as someone who thought about resistance, who imagined a different future. If he reported this, she'd be executed. But something in his body language, in the way he'd shown her those terrible files, made her believe she could trust him. Calvor studied the drawing for a long moment. Then, he took the stylus from her hand and added to the image. He drew more figures, both caliph and human, all standing together outside the broken bars. He drew a symbol above them that Sarah didn't recognize, but that seemed to represent something aspirational, something hopeful. They stood in silence for several minutes, the broken terminal forgotten, communicating through gestures and simple drawings. Calvor explained, through patient pantomime, that he was part of a faction within the Caliph military that opposed the current leadership's policies toward other species, that he'd seen too much war, too much pointless destruction, and had come to believe that the Caliph Empire's approach to galactic dominance was unsustainable and morally bankrupt. Sarah explained, through equally careful gestures, about the human resistance network she'd been building, about the encoded information she'd been gathering, about her attempts to communicate with Earth. Every revelation was a calculated risk, but Kael'vor's responses convinced her more and more that he was genuine in his opposition to the system. Finally, Kael'vor held up one of his hands in a gesture that clearly meant wait. He reached into a compartment on his armor and pulled out a small data chip, the kind used for secure military communications. He showed it to Sarah, then pointed at her, then at the chip, then made a complex series of gestures that she interpreted as him offering to help her smuggle information out of the facility. Sarah's eyes widened. This was far more than she'd dared hope for. With Kael'vor's help, she could bypass the normal communication restrictions entirely. She could get detailed intelligence back to Earth, warn them about the new protocols being planned, provide information that might help humanity negotiate better terms for human workers throughout Kael'th space. But why would he do this? What did he stand to gain? And what terrible price would he pay if they were discovered? As if reading her thoughts, Kael'vor drew another picture. He drew the Kael'th Empire as a large structure with cracks running through it. He drew figures inside those cracks, both Kael'th and other species, pushing the cracks wider. Then, he drew the structure beginning to transform into something different, something less rigid and hierarchical. He was telling her that change was already happening, that there were others like him working from inside the system, and that an alliance with humans could accelerate that change. Sarah felt tears pricking her eyes. For months, she'd felt alone, isolated in her small acts of resistance, convinced that she was fighting an immovable system that would grind her down no matter what she did. Now, impossibly, she'd found an ally in the last place she'd expected, a Kael'th warrior who shared her vision of a different future. They reactivated their translator collars, the familiar hum resuming in Sarah's ears. Kael'vor immediately adopted his previous cold, authoritative demeanor. "Have you completed the repair?" he asked in a tone that suggested he'd been waiting impatiently. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, slipping the data chip Kael'vor had given her into her toolkit with movements she hoped looked natural to any cameras that might be watching. "The terminal is fully functional now." "Good. Return to your assigned duties. I will file the maintenance report." Sarah nodded and headed for the exit, her mind reeling from what had just happened. As she reached the doorway, Kael'vor spoke again, his voice still cold and formal for the benefit of any monitoring systems. "Human worker, you performed adequately. Should future maintenance in restricted areas be required, I will request your assignment specifically." It was a promise, Sarah realized. A promise of future contact, future opportunities to work together. She allowed herself the smallest of smiles as she made her way back to the regular archives. Over the following weeks, Sarah was called to perform maintenance on terminals in restricted areas with increasing frequency. Each time, Kael'vor was assigned as her escort. Each time, they turned off their translators and communicated through their developing system of gestures and drawings, sharing information and coordinating their efforts. Kael'vor provided Sarah with information about Kael'th military deployments, about political factions within the Empire, about technologies and strategies that Earth needed to understand if humanity was ever going to negotiate from a position of strength. Sarah provided Kael'vor with insights into human culture, human capabilities, and the growing resistance movement among human workers throughout Kael'th space. But, more than that, they were building something neither of them had expected, a genuine friendship across species lines. Kael'vor shared stories from his long military career, tales that revealed the toll that constant warfare had taken on his psyche. He'd been a young soldier during the tail end of the Integration Wars, had participated in the conquest of 3 different species, and carried the weight of that violence with him every day. "I believed what they taught us." He communicated through gestures during one of their meetings, his movements heavy with regret. "That we were bringing order to chaos, civilization to barbarism. But, after seeing what we did to the Kresh, to the Morthian Collective, to so many others, I began to question. And once you start questioning the foundations of your entire society, it becomes impossible to stop." Sarah shared her own stories, about growing up on Earth, about human history with all its triumphs and horrors, about why she'd chosen to take this job despite knowing how humans were treated in Calith space. "We've made so many mistakes as a species," she communicated. "We've fought horrible wars, committed terrible atrocities against each other. But we've also learned from those mistakes, or at least some of us have tried to. We've built systems and values that say every person matters, that no one is inherently superior to anyone else just because of what species they were born into. I wanted to believe that eventually, the rest of the galaxy could learn those lessons too. Some of us are trying," Calvor assured her. "Change is slow, especially in a society as rigid as ours. But there are more of us than you might think, Calith, who are tired of endless war and oppression. We've been waiting for the right moment, the right catalyst to push for real change." "And you think humans could be that catalyst?" Sarah asked through gestures. Calvor's response was emphatic. "Humans have something that most species in the galaxy have lost or never had: hope. You believe things can be better, and you're willing to fight to make them better even when the odds are impossibly against you. That kind of stubborn optimism is exactly what the galaxy needs right now." Their alliance deepened, but so did the risks. The new protocols for human workers were moving closer to implementation, and Sarah's resistance network had grown large enough that it was becoming difficult to keep hidden. There had been close calls, moments when a Calith supervisor had noticed humans making hand gestures that seemed slightly too deliberate, or when security scans had picked up unusual patterns in the archived documents Sarah had been encoding. Then came the day when everything nearly fell apart. Sarah arrived at the archives to find the entire facility in lockdown. Calith security forces were everywhere, searching workstations, questioning workers, pulling up security footage for review. Sarah's heart sank as she saw Lisa being escorted away by guards, her face pale with terror. Vexthar, their supervisor, stood at the center of the archives with his 4 arms crossed, his expression one of vindictive satisfaction. "We know there is a resistance network operating within this facility," he announced to the assembled human workers. "We know you have been communicating with each other, sharing information, sabotaging our operations. This ends today. Anyone found to be involved will face the maximum possible punishment under Calith law." Sarah forced herself to remain calm, to show no reaction even as panic threatened to overwhelm her. Had they discovered her encoded documents? Had they broken the gestural communication code? Was Lisa being interrogated right now, possibly being tortured for information about the network? The security sweep continued for hours. Sarah watched as Calith guards tore apart workstations, examined documents with new scrutiny, questioned workers one by one. When her turn came, she was taken to a small interrogation room where a Calith security officer subjected her to an aggressive interview about her activities and associations. Sarah stuck to simple, truthful answers about her work duties while revealing nothing about the resistance network. Yes, she socialized with other human workers during mealtimes. No, she hadn't noticed any organized resistance. Yes, she sometimes made mistakes in her document processing, but they were honest errors, not sabotage. The interrogation lasted 3 hours, but Sarah's story never changed, and she gave them nothing. When she was finally released and allowed to return to her quarters, she found Yuki and Amara huddled together, but Lisa's bunk was empty. They took her to the security detention center. Yuki whispered, tears streaming down her face. "They think she's a ringleader of the resistance. Sarah, what are we going to do?" Sarah sat down heavily on her bunk, her mind racing. She needed to get a message to Calvor, needed his help to find out what was happening to Lisa and whether the resistance network had been compromised. But her scheduled maintenance appointment wasn't for another 2 days, and she had no way to contact him outside of their established meetings. That night, Sarah lay awake trying to formulate a plan. She couldn't let Lisa take the fall for the resistance network Sarah had built. She couldn't let the Calith crush the small flame of hope she'd helped kindle among the human workers. And she couldn't betray Calvor by revealing his involvement, which would certainly mean his execution. The answer came to her in the early hours of the morning. It was risky, possibly suicidal, but it was the only option she could see. She would force a maintenance emergency that would require immediate attention, creating a reason for her to be assigned to restricted areas where she could accidentally encounter Calvor. It would look suspicious, but if she was careful, she could maintain plausible deniability. Sarah spent the next day subtly sabotaging one of the archive's critical data systems in a way that would look like a natural failure rather than intentional damage. By evening, the system had crashed completely, taking down several other connected terminals. The overnight supervisor, a caliph named Greshmal who was even less patient than Vexthar, immediately demanded that the problem be fixed before the morning shift. Sarah volunteered for the emergency maintenance, arguing that she'd worked on similar systems before and could have it operational quickly. Greshmal agreed, too focused on meeting his productivity quotas to question her motives. He assigned her a caliph escort from the night security detail and sent her off to begin repairs. Sarah's heart sank when she saw her escort. It wasn't Kael'vor. It was a young warrior named Pexlin who she'd never seen before. She'd have to complete the actual repair without any opportunity to contact her ally. But, as she worked on the damaged system, Pexlin received a communication through his collar. He listened for a moment, then turned to Sarah. You are to be reassigned to a different maintenance task. Senior Officer Kael'vor requires a terminal repair in the deep archives and has requested you specifically based on your previous adequate performance. I will escort you to the location, then return to my regular duties. Sarah nearly collapsed with relief. Kael'vor had somehow learned about the security lockdown and had created a legitimate reason for them to meet. 20 minutes later, she was alone with him in the deep archives, their translators deactivated, communicating through their now sophisticated system of gestures. Your friend Lisa will be released in 2 days, Kael'vor communicated. The security investigation found evidence of human communication networks, but not enough to prove organized resistance. Lisa is being held as a warning to others, but they don't have grounds to charge her with any serious crime. Sarah's relief was overwhelming. Thank you, she gestured. But they know we're organizing. They'll be watching more closely now, which is why we need to accelerate our plans, Kael'vor responded. The faction I represent is nearly ready to make our move. We've been gathering support among moderate caliphs who are tired of the current leadership's policies. But we need leverage, something that will force the conservative factions to accept change rather than escalating to civil war. What kind of leverage? Sarah asked. Kael'vor's answer changed everything. Evidence of the Integration War's atrocities, made public across the entire galaxy. The current Caliph government has kept those records sealed for 2,000 years. If that information were to be released, if every species in the galaxy knew what the Caliph Empire has done, the political pressure would be enormous. Combined with internal pressure from our reform faction, it might be enough to force real change. Sarah understood immediately what he was asking. The files she'd seen during their first meeting, the records of billions of deaths and erased civilizations, released for all the galaxy to see. It would be devastating to the Caliph Empire's reputation, would probably result in sanctions or worse from other galactic powers. But it would also create an opportunity for reformers like Kael'vor to push for fundamental change in how the Empire treated other species. I can get those files, Sarah gestured. But releasing them across the galaxy, how?